Do you remember this video posted by James Hoffmann in his Weird Coffee Science series where he microwaves his coffee beans?
I'm going to try and convince you to go and put some coffee beans in the microwave.
In the video, he notices a difference in taste between microwave beans and room temperature beans, but isn't able to pinpoint the reasoning as to why they taste different. I was really curious about what had happened, and I decided to scrub through the comment section of his YouTube video and also his blog post that he made for the video. Since Hoffmann didn't come to a conclusion as to why microwaved coffee beans tasted differently than room temperature beans, there were ample ideas in the comment sections. And there were two comments that really stood out and made me question if they were actually onto something. These two comments talked about how beans crush and shatter differently depending on their temperature. I decided to do a series of experiments to test out the theories that they had. So the too long didn't watch summary is that a coffee bean's temperature before grinding changes its grind distribution. Let me show you how I came to this conclusion with a series of experiments. The first experiment was with a Porlex hand grinder combined with the Coffee Grind Size app designed by Jonathan over at the Coffee Ad Astra blog. I would grind the beans at different temperatures and compare their charts. The three temperatures were freezing, room temperature, and microwave for 1 minute. I ground the beans, evenly distributed the coffee with the hand grinder, took photos of the grinds, and plopped them into the app. The data you end up with is a grind distribution graph, just like this. What this graph does is it takes the grind particles and arranges it by their grind size, which then allows you to get a better perspective of your grind consistency. My findings weren't that different from each other. Nothing really stood out. I decided to replicate the experiment, but this time with the Rancilio Rocky electric grinder. Perhaps the differences weren't noticeable with the low-end hand grinder. I repeated the process. Was there something that would catch my eye this time around? Sadly enough, that wasn't the case. I started to doubt my approach at this point. Twice I'd done something and it hadn't really shown any real conclusive evidence of anything. I looked at the results I was getting from the Coffee Grind Size app and realized that I wasn't looking at a large enough sample. The data was still a picture extrapolated, with each sheet of paper having around 0.3 grams of coffee sprinkled across it. It would be a different story if I looked at, let's say, 10 grams of coffee in one single sample. I decided to use a Groove ruler to see if I could quickly look at the grind distribution with this tool, but it just wasn't accurate enough for my needs. But guess what? Groove has another tool, the Groove Sifter. The second method was to use a Groove sifter and sift the coffee into different batches depending on their grind size. If you don't know what a Groove sifter is, it's typically used as a device to remove boulders and fines from your grinds before brewing. What I wanted to do, however, was to use this device to break down the distribution of grinds. After playing around with this method of experimentation, I decided on the range I would distribute the grinds in. It would be from 0 to 600 microns. How big is a micron, you ask? If this is a centimeter, then this is a millimeter, and a micron is 1/1000th of a millimeter. Pretty darn small. Now back to the experiment. I decided on the range I would distribute the grinds in. It would be from 0 to 600 microns, then in 100 micron increments all the way up to 1100 microns. Going below 600 microns was just a fines nightmare. I experimented with 10 grams of coffee. I started to sift off the top layer beginning with 1100 microns and above, and the 1000 to 1100 range microns. Once I had measured out and put those segments aside, I changed the meshes and sifted out 900 to 1000 and 800 to 900 microns. I kept this process up until I'd sifted, measured, and divided the 10 grams of coffee into 7 different segments. I ensured that each section and experiment sample went through a rigid process down to the shake duration and groove taps. I repeated this process for all 3 heats that I used for the prior failed experiments, making sure to clean up the whole station and grinder between experiments to prevent any cross-contamination of grinds. So what were the results? Here's how the data looks like on its own. It's really hard to read as numbers, so let's convert it all into grind size distribution charts, like the app did earlier in our failed experiments. I compared the 3 samples to each other. I had a frozen sample, a room temperature sample, and a microwave sample. And what do you know? All of these have different grind size distributions. I'll be focusing on the room temperature sample versus the microwave sample moving forwards in this video. So the heat change had an impact on grind size distribution. When grinding 10 grams of coffee, the microwave beans had around 0.45 grams more fines and 0.7 grams more boulders. That's a 11.5% of the grind's distribution shifted from the middle of the grind distribution to its edges. I looked at the data and wasn't too sure what to make out of it, so I decided to take a shower. This is where my mind does its best work. After considering the data and pondering what it means, I gravitated to one specific question. Does heat impact the brittleness in beans? I came across the ductile brittle transition concept, and I knew that this was the missing puzzle piece that I was looking for. Before sharing more discoveries, if you like content like this, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and maybe even check out my Patreon, where I share all of these weird things that I do with coffee before they become YouTube videos. Let's unpack the 2 words, ductile and brittle. When something shatters easily, we say it's brittle. Think of a firm and crispy cookie. It readily breaks into pieces with some pressure. When something is pliable and bends or stretches instead, we say it's ductile. Think of a soft and chewy cookie. It doesn't crack that easily, instead it bends and is flexible. The ductile to brittle transition is a material property referring to when a change in temperature causes something to go from being brittle to ductile and vice versa. Here are 2 more examples to really wrap your head around this. You've probably seen videos of something like a rubber ball being frozen in liquid nitrogen. Something that's usually soft and bouncy becomes brittle and shatters when it hits the ground. And if you ever wanted to be a medieval blacksmith, you would need to use the ductile property to shape a sword with a furnace and hammer, heating the metal, making it flexible and pliable. Then use a hammer to shape it while the metal is in the state. I decided to push this newfound knowledge one step further with 2 different experiments by adding another layer of variables into the mix. I started off roasting the same green coffee bean into 2 different roast levels, light roast and dark roast. Since different bean varieties have different densities, it was important to ensure that the same bean was being used for both the light and dark roast here. My findings were that light and dark roasts were both impacted by the microwaving in similar ways. Unlike my initial results, I noticed that this experiment showed fewer fines with the microwave beans. Weird. With the findings of my previous light and dark roast experiment, I wanted to see if I could minimize fines in lower end hand grinders. So I did the test with the Porlex hand grinder that I had, making sure that I used the same beans as the light and dark roast experiment, expecting lower fines when microwaved. But this time around, the samples had grinds pushed from the mid-range area into the fines and boulder region. This was similar results to the first experiments that I did. You can achieve a different grind size distribution by manipulating the bean's temperature before grinding them. It's not as predictable as one would have hoped because the bean varietal, the bean roast level, and also how you grind your beans all impact the grind distribution. With that said, here are some generalizations that I got from my experiments. Room temperature equals normal distribution. Microwaved equals consistently higher in boulders, lower in mid-range grinds, and maybe lower in fines. Frozen beans also had an impact on grind size distribution, as we saw in my first experiment. From that one sample, it had more boulders, less mid-range grinds, and the same amount of fines. I would have to do more experiments to really pinpoint how consistent the frozen distribution characteristics are. Now I turn it back to you. Are there any other ways we could utilize a change in grind size distribution to brew better coffee? Is there perhaps something you think I need to look further into? If so, then comment below with those thoughts. I would not have been able to do these experiments without the knowledge from other coffee giants. So a shout out to these cool cats. Jonathan, who created the Coffee Grind Size app, found over at the Coffee Ad Astra blog. Robert, who talks about grind distribution in his Spicy Espresso coffee post. And of course, Mr. Hoffmann himself for his Weird Coffee Science video series and everything he's done for the world of specialty coffee. I'll see you in the next video.